Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Ask the Experts. I'm Diane Southard, founder and CEO of Your DNA Guide and host of today's Ask the Experts series. Today, I have with me my dear friend, Scott Fisher. Scott, welcome.
Thank you, Diane. It's so great to be with you again. It's been a while. It's been since Roots Tech.
Right? I know. It has
Yeah.
been a minute. So I'm just going to take it a minute. For those of you who don't know Scott, I have a little bio here I'm going to read, and then we're going to dive right into the questions and take advantage of Scott's vast experience in the world of family history. So for those of you who don't know, Scott Fisher is a Connecticut native who's been in radio since his youth. He has spent 4 decades of time as a passionate roots sleuth. A longtime morning show host, best known for his long tenure in Salt Lake City, Utah, Fisher is also the author of New York City Methodist Marriages, 1785 to 1893, which was published by Picton Press in 1994. He also has been published in the New York Genealogical and Biogeographical Society Journal, the Catholic Ancestor, Journal of the Catholic Family History Society of England, as well as the Ensign. His 16 books on the families of both his and his wife's ancestors, written over 30 years, fill the better part of the shelf in the Fisher Family Room Library. In 2013, Scott Fisher started a weekly podcast and radio show called Extreme Genes, America's Family History Show, which is how I met you. So there's your official introduction. Welcome.
That's a lot. It's like, wait a minute, who is that guy?
I know. People read my bio too. I'm like, oh my gosh, wow, that's a lot of stuff. But you've earned all of those accolades in all those years.
Oh, it's accolades, but it's a lot. Just doing a lot of things. It's been great. It's been a joy in my life to do all that.
I hope so, because if it's not, you're doing something wrong, I say.
Yeah, no kidding. A waste of time.
All right, let's start with how I was introduced to you. So tell me and tell all of us, how did you come up with this inspiration for this Extreme Genes radio show / podcast?
I've been thinking about it for some time before I started it in 2013. And the idea was, I was still on the air on a daily basis in Salt Lake City and had access to a studio at that time, which is, in those days, that's what you needed to do a radio show and a podcast. And so I had it in my mind that on weekend radio shows nationally, you would hear things like, fix your car, gardening show, things like that. To me, just bored the heck out of me. I listen to the radio driving around on the weekends, and I think, my goodness, if somebody could do an amazing radio show on family history with the stories and the techniques, and if they had a personality with it, And I thought, man, that would be really a fun thing to do. So I just pondered it over time, and the radio business was changing, and I was getting a little disgruntled with it. And over time, when my last morning show ended at the end of 2012, and I picked up a midday show, I said, I don't want to get up at 4:30 in the morning anymore. I don't have to do that. But I'd still like to have access to the studio, and I'd still like to have something, regular to do every day. I was too young to just not do something regularly each day. So I picked up the midday show. They said, yeah, use this and you can develop whatever. So there was a talk station within our group of radio stations in Salt Lake, and they loved the idea that we could put this show together. And so I started it. The first show was in July of 2013. And it was kind of interesting because I really wasn't a big part of this community at that time. But I knew some people at the Family History Library in downtown Salt Lake. So every week was a scramble to find somebody new that would come on and talk about, various things and people with their stories and their techniques and all that. And so, eventually it evolved in terms of knowing who I could reach out to, often many times, which is not unusual. Most talk shows have their regular guests, their favorites, and that type of thing. And so it evolved, and it got easier and easier to do, and easier to find guests. And so I got picked up. My first stations outside of Utah were in Alabama,
Huh.
And then it got picked up. And at our peak, we were at 60 some odd radio stations around the country, including in Boston, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Dallas. We've been in Denver, Las Vegas, and then a lot of smaller markets as well.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know how many states. I don't know what that all ended up with. But, at the end of this past year, I felt like I had kind of run the course with it. And
Yeah.
so pulled the plug on it at that point, although I've done, one show since for just as a podcast. The radio stations, of course, they're not sitting around waiting for me. So we did that after Roots Tech, talked about the generative AI and that huge announcement, which I think is just a monstrous game changer that maybe we can talk about here later.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's quite a history. Like I always find it fascinating as a business owner, anytime marketing is successful, right? Because that's what happens.
Yeah.
You create something that creates interest and it creates buzz and it creates excitement. And then more and more and more markets pick it up, right? And you've got something that resonates when it's spreading. So I love that.
Yeah, combine my two interests. I mean, I've been on the radio since I was 15 years old. That was the first time I went on the air. We had a high school, we had 15 minutes of airtime on our local little station in Connecticut as part of a high school club. And then I got hired setting up remotes when I was 16 for $2 an hour. And then I wound up filling in for the news guy when he, missed his newscast because of a snowstorm or something. I'd step in there. And so I've always loved doing radio. And I thought, at the time that I started, podcasts still were not as huge as they are right now. And it's like, well, this can be my place.
Right.
To combine my two loves, being on the radio and family history, which at that point I'd done for over 30 years. And I thought I had some things to offer. And the nice thing is I felt like I never wanted to be the professional as such. And I never did anything to get certified as such, because I felt like, as just a person who's passionate about family history, then I knew the questions to ask the experts, and I could kind of be the person that goes between the listeners and the experts, somewhere position in that.
Well, and you were successful. So thinking about then all the people that you had on Extreme Genes over the years, what's a memorable guest or really fascinating topic? I mean, myself excluded, of course. You don't want to have to tell everybody that I was your favorite.
How many things can I talk about you, Diane? Come on. Well, I've always go back to, and I still remember the number because it was easy. Episode 100, if you want to look it up.
Okay.
Steve Anderson, who had worked for Family Search, he grew up in Minnesota. And and I won't get into all the details on it, but he wound up doing DNA tests with his siblings. And as the story goes on the show, he found out that of the 9 kids in his family, there were 8 fathers and none of them were his dad.
Wow.
That was a pretty good one. That was rather memorable.
I guess so.
And there was a lot more to that story. And there was a follow-up to it later as they discovered some more things. So you can listen for that. Of course, the podcasts are all still out there. There's almost 500 episodes, and the stories don't get old, right?
No.
So they're still around. There was another one about a woman who was walking past this old area where people had been buried at some point. She saw this family out there and went and was frightened, followed them into the woods. Her boyfriend said, "There's nothing out there." And they stumbled across this old cemetery and actually located these graves of this family. It was exactly as described, that dated back to the Civil War. So that was really interesting. I mean, there's just so many different things. Where do you start?
How can you even choose? Where do you start?
Where do you start? Well, and of course, you and I both rode the tidal wave of DNA.
Right.
As it became, you in your space and me in mine, though we overlap, somewhat. But I mean, mine was more about the discoveries people were making, and yours was teaching them brilliantly, as you always do, how to do it. And those stories were amazing too. And I'm always fascinated by how ugly sometimes stories are when people discover bio families, but it still brings them healing because they learn the truth.
Yeah.
And that's a struggle for a lot of folks.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, I think that you're talking about, this tidal wave, and I think that's the perfect way to describe it. It did feel that way. It came fast and furious and overwhelming, right?
Wow.
I feel like,
Well,
yeah,
it's funny because at the radio station I was at when I first started Extreme Genes, our vice president of programming said to me, "I don't know that Extreme Genes is the name for a show. It doesn't explain what it's about. It should be about family history and this and that." And I had, it's hard to choose a name for something like that. And I poked around with it, and I went back and I said, "No, I'm sticking with it. That's the name of the show." And this is in 2013. Now, DNA was getting a good foothold at that.
yeah.
Um, but by 2015 and all that, all of a sudden, the title of the show fit into where we were in our space at that point perfectly. It was kind of
Almost
funny
like
how that worked out.
a prophecy, Scott.
Yes, kind of.
So I just wanted to share. I love Shirley's play on words
Thank you,
here.
Shirley.
Extreme. Thanks to both of you, which I thought was sweet. And then Adam is saying he's missing Extreme Genes, but I hope, Adam, you were listening. Scott says we can still go back and listen to all of those episodes because it is a podcast now. And so no reason to hold back. Just binge listen, I think.
Well, you have to understand that most people who are in our space already listen to the show as a podcast.
Yeah.
And a podcast can be any length, long, short. It can be any day. It can be every month. It can be every couple of weeks. The radio show has to be every week. The radio shows, if you're taking a break, you have to fill that with something. And so, when you do 10 years of every week and you can't miss, for instance, last year I went to Europe for 3 weeks, as I'm going to do starting next week again. And so I had to do all this work ahead of time, either to pre-record all those shows and edit them and mix them. And by the way, that's the other thing. They have to be a set time, right down to the split second for each segment. And then when you would get back, you'd have to scramble to pick up where you were.
Content, yeah.
And so it was reaching the point where, at this stage of my life, I want to travel more. I want to do more things. My wife had just retired, and it's like she wanted more things to, for us to go out and do, including just recreate, play golf once in a while. And I have lots and lots of projects. So it wasn't a matter of ending the podcast. It was really more of a matter of ending the radio show that required so much effort at that time. And it was fine. At the end of the day, I was very much at peace with it. And, I've been very blessed in my life, and we're in good shape. So I'm glad everybody loved it, and I appreciate all the support through the years, and I hope you keep listening to it. We still have ridiculous numbers for not putting out new shows every week. I love it.
Right? It's awesome. It's because it's so relevant, like you're saying. Like it really hits all the buttons, the story, but the tips and all the things.
Yeah, it's interesting though. You look back on some of the things from back in the day where something brand new came along. That's some of those things like 2014 are quite outdated, and but nonetheless, it almost is a journal of where our space has been.
A history, definitely.
Yeah, something like that.
All right. Well, since you have stepped away and gained back some of this time, what have you been doing with your time?
As I mentioned, some traveling, certainly that. And I've been finishing up some of those books that we've been talking about. I've actually been updating a few of them. There's one left to update, and then my wife, I have to stay on her to write her own history. I've finished my own up to this point, obviously. And I write these for the sake of my family. I mean, I make copies available for family search, that type of thing, where they're relevant to that, so that others can benefit from it. I mean, that's the key to it.
Yeah.
But I wanted to make sure that this library is complete, and it will be, I think, within the next year. And then the other thing that I've been doing, I have just fallen in love with all the photo tools that are out there right now. And have really gone to town on this. And it's amazing the old pictures that we would get, and we would just be so thrilled to have something with tears and cuts, but it's old and it's original, and we have this, and now you can scan it and you can go through with Photoshop elements, the little baby sister of Photoshop, and just fix these things and sharpen it. And then you can go to MyHeritage, and their sharpening tool's fantastic. And their colorization, when you want to do that, some you want to, some you don't, some it works for, some they don't. Unbelievable. So I started going through, beginning in the 1850s, the earliest pictures we had on both sides of my wife's family and mine, and scanning them all and fixing them and making them beautiful again. And then laying them out basically just in a Word file, because the one thing about publishing books through, standard places is they're usually very expensive. You're very limited to how you can lay them out. And I could just lay them out in my own way. So this is the first one.
Okay.
And I made the cover myself with just lots of pictures of the family through all the generations, and found that even from the 1850s all the way through the 1920s, it only makes a book this thick. Now, the albums themselves are, all these different periods. So these are going to be less likely to be thrown out by the next generation. And I write, beautiful. Yeah, and I write little stories about the pictures and who they are. If I can get that.
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah.
That looks so nice.
Yeah, it's very simple. I think as we get older, it's more challenging to keep up with a lot of technology. I do my best to do that, but I know there are people a lot better at a lot of things than I am. But I'm very comfortable with this level to do that. And so I'm up through 1994 right now. But now we've got my 4 kids and us 30 years ago. And the first half of the 90s is bigger than any single decade that I've had previous, and it's exhausting. And there's too much screen time, so I'm trying to learn to pace myself, because I'll get through the day and I'm just absolutely fried.
Yeah. Do you have a process that you're using for these like mountains of photos? Is there something that you're looking for? Are you looking for a theme? How are you managing it?
Oh, I'm doing it through, by decade, by family.
Okay.
Sometimes you don't know when a decade, especially the early pictures, when somebody had only 1 to 3 pictures of themselves in a lifetime. When were those pictures taken? Where were they? Hopefully the name of the photographer's on them. And then you get into the 20s and 30s, there are a lot more pictures, but still not an overwhelming number. 40s, it really picks up. 50s, even more so. The 60s, everybody had, Kodak cameras at that time. And we just see the availability. When I'm kind of excited when we get to the 21st century, because it's all where it gets digital. I don't have to digitize anymore, as far as it goes. So what I do is, I've been the collector, and my wife, Julie, and I have been kind of the go-to people for all branches of both of our families over the years. And people have either given us originals or sent us scans of the ones that are really special. And so, I've kept folders of those on my desktop, or I scan them with an HP scanner and printer. And then I go to work either repairing them and then putting them on through MyHeritage, and doing my best to get rid of those watermarks. I hate those things. I don't like that. But that's been great. And then I finished up a few histories. Did one on my mother's family during World War II, and the role of herself and all of her siblings. She had 4 brothers at that time, and who were five brothers, and 3 of them were in the war, in the military, and 2 of them were in severe combat, and 1 of them got injured in training, so he never got to do any of that stuff. So we wrote about all of them, and it was really kind of fun, because my mother collected, all the family, kept all the letters from the war, from family, from friends, from military guys who wrote her, because she was an actress and a model and things. So she had a lot of love in her life back in the 40s. So she saved all that stuff. And then I was able to actually get my uncle's Navy records from the military, which gave me timelines. So I put this together more as a timeline. So yeah, you're right. You have to kind of come up with what's the theme. How are you going to
Sure.
You know, how are you going to do that? So I try to keep them within decades. The hardest part with doing it by decades is what happens when you get to 69, 70. Which
Yeah.
year is it? You're not sure, and you can't tell from the age of the people in it. It's
Yeah.
only a 1 year difference. So you kind of have to make a judgment sometimes.
Yeah. So
But
we've got several people asking about how, like Catherine here, who publishes your books, or what are you doing to print them?
I found a local printer in Davis County, Utah, who I've worked with for years. I mentioned I've done all these books, and they do big jobs for people and small jobs. And I usually only do 6 to 10 copies of these books because they're just for the family and they're somewhat expensive. And if you're doing 16 of them and they each cost, $100 per book, and you're doing many pictures in color and you're doing a fancy cover and you want, and I do them this way because I have it in my mind that as I look at the way we've collected in the past, there's just so much people don't know who these people are.
Yeah.
And it's just, and kids don't have the shelf space.
Right.
They don't necessarily, unless they really are interested in old things, there's a very good chance a lot of that stuff's going to go away. And so I do this in a way where I can visualize, 8 or 9 of these books would only be about what, this much.
Yeah.
Anybody can have that and also see them all beautiful with the stories with them. There's really never any reason for them to say, oh, we don't need these, we don't want these.
Right.
So I think that it's more important to preserve the images than the originals in my mind, although I love the originals.
So Karen is asking about that. What are you doing with the actual photos after you scan them?
Oh, I have them. I keep them in albums, especially the oldest ones. They're just absolute treasures to have from the 1860s. I have like 8 or 9 daguerreotypes from the Fisher line, which is insane, from New York City. Yeah. They're real treasures. And I don't think my kids are likely to toss any of that stuff. But we know this, we know that the concern that we all have is what happens to this stuff when we're gone.
Yeah.
And because it's important. And as we know from the studies at, Emory and BYU, that, the kids who know their history are better equipped to deal with their lives. And so this is a good reason why this is important to me, because there's a genuine benefit in this other than just, it's a fun hobby like scrapbooking,
Right. Yeah. So switching topics now, you talked a little bit about, all of your photo work, and people are commenting. Lots of people are in your position and are finding some help in your methodology and what you've done. Let's swap over. I know you've done some work with AI, and especially what Family Search is currently offering. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, if you were following Roots Tech, the big announcement at Roots Tech was something that they are saying will be as big. It's the next DNA thing, right? The big mammoth wave of information that's going to come from generative AI. Generative AI is where Family Search, for instance, is taking all the material that they have digitized throughout the years that has not been indexed by human beings. And they're saying, okay, instead of making a form where we're going to have AI go through and pick out the names like they did, say, with the 1950 census, they're going to index every word of handwriting, which, of course, Diane, as you know, was the holy grail forever. When will that ever happen? Well, it has. And so they've taken all of their property and land records in the United States and threw them up there. And this generative AI has gone through and digitized all those pages. So basically, I've been searching for the names of my people as keywords instead of as names. And you can search as names, but I found that it makes more sense to put their names in with that around it. And by the way, you can find that at FamilySearch/en/labs, LABS. And they have several new things that they're doing at the moment there on Family Search. And it's the very first thing that you come across there. And so I ran to a computer at Family Search because I like working with bigger screens. I don't do this stuff very well on my phone. And maybe that's unique to me, but I think maybe it's just the generational thing. But nonetheless, I went in there and I found, for instance, that my great-grandfather in New York, this guy right here, Andrew Fisher, my fireman ancestor, he and his wife in the late 1860s bought land in Long Island, which I would have had no reason to look for land purchases in Long Island. And then they sold it three years later. And then he bought property in Brooklyn and then sold it like 2 days after his divorce from his wife, which was interesting. I mean, neither of these stories were earth shattering in any way, but it showed the potential and the power of what can come from that. Because as you know, Diane, the land records will often give the relationships of people named in it, especially if land is being left, in a will or something like that. And yeah, they do have probate records in there too. So on my wife's side, we found land records of some of her ancestors who moved from Pennsylvania to Michigan. And then we were able to go online and Google the plat. There's the description of it in the land records. And we went to the original plat of the little town that her people were from, identified where it is, looked at where it is today. And we actually found a house on this piece of property along a river. And then I looked on Zillow and found the house was built in 1880. And that's right when her second great grandfather was living on that land. So he built that house. So I thought that's really fun. The best one that happened for me with this so far was just 2 weeks ago. And I went up to, I found a story. My great grandmother had moved to Davis County, Utah, West Bountiful in the 1890s. And there's a lot of stories surrounding that that I won't get into right now. But there were stories about how the Ute Indians would come through and they'd knock down the farmers' fences and they'd come and ask for food. And my great grandmother would hide the kids under a space under one of the rooms there that was in the foundation. And my grandfather had talked about this. And so I was able, from finding this using generative AI, I went to the Davis County Recorder's office and they mapped out exactly where the land was. And I was able to drive right to it a few minutes later. And it's still rural because it was bought up by an oil refinery. And so it's fenced, but it's exactly as it was 140 years ago, which is absolutely amazing. One other thing I use AI for is it's a great new thing called Descript, Descript, and it repairs old audio. So I had an interview with my grandfather from 1974 when he was 88 years old, just a few months before he passed away. My mother did it in Oregon. I had it on a cassette tape, and I digitized it some years ago, and it had a lot of hiss in it. But with Descript, and he was off mic too most of the time. Suddenly it sounds like he's wearing a professional microphone, and we recorded it last week.
Wow.
It was amazing. And I have posted his interview now on Family Search as such and on Ancestry and other places, so other descendants will have that. But I was really excited about what AI could do for audio.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. So it sounds like you're kind of dipping your finger into lots of things now with all of your extra time. Just to wrap up, you mentioned when we first started that you didn't want to become a professional for several reasons. And I love that your perspective still feels like what everybody listening is feeling like. Most of you listening probably don't want to become professionals either, but you want to become experts, and that's different, right? You want to become experts.
Well, I think an expert can be more expert than many professionals, to be honest.
That's right, right? And so I love that. I love how you've decided, I want to become an expert in creating these photo books. I want to become an expert in using this generative AI for this part of my family history. And I love that we all get to do that, right? We all get to choose. But if someone listening is kind of just starting out, what would you tell them now after you've been doing this for decades? What is a great first step for them as they're just beginning family history research?
Well, part of it depends on what stage of life you're in. My thought is, if you're younger and you still have, say, grandparents and aunts and uncles and or even older parents around, get their stories recorded one way or another. I mean, it's wonderful we have phones right now that we can do things with them that we could never have done before. It's fantastic. And we can preserve a lot of this material. I would get that. I would gather everything that I can from more distant relatives, outside of your immediate family, whether it's first cousins, second cousins. Um, I've always maintained, and I look back from my early years of doing this in the 1980s. One of the things I discovered for myself, because nobody taught me, was to track down descendants of immigrant ancestors. And that's how I cracked my name line open. Was I found some guy in upstate New York who had a letter left by his great grandmother for his mother in the 1930s, and it named the parents of my second great grandfather and where they came from in England, and it was fantastic.
That's awesome.
And then I had photographs and that type of thing. So, in my mind, there are an awful lot of people who have an awful lot of important material who never put anything on Family Search, who never put anything on Ancestry. I've always called it the archive in the attic. Well, where's the attic? You have to trace it down and do that. Once you've kind of run the course of tracking down as many of these people as you can and what they may have to share with you, either by giving you an original or by giving you a scan of something, then it's a matter of starting to become a little more expertise on the research side of it. And there's so much that's already online that you can do and go from there. But hopefully you can not just take what other people have done in their research, but you can contribute to it with your own original research in libraries and archives.
Okay. That's excellent advice. We've got a lot of people in the chat asking about that address from Family Search. So I see it here. I'm going to put it in the chat for people.
Okay.
So this is to their labs, and it looks like you need to sign in, and then the second step is going to be to choose an experiment. Is that where you?
Yes, the sign in. It's the first one. There is the one you want. It's full. It's called full index technically.
Okay,
and I have gone and found all kinds of stuff in there. Like I said, nothing that really changed my life except for finding that property that I'd heard so much about from my great grandmother and her children and the natives coming through. And it was written about in a novel by my mother's first cousin, who was a best-selling author. So it was just kind of this mythical place. And it was like, whoa, there it was. Because of generative AI, I was able to find it. So, but I've looked, and what's really helping right now, it's helping people in enslaved research, because they have plantation records included in these documents. So people are blasting past the 1870 blockage there and finding names that they've never been able to see before. So if you have an enslaved ancestor back there, this could be something that could be of great benefit to you.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen really quick so you can walk us through here. So I've gone to that labs that we put in the chat.
Yep.
And so is this the one you're talking about? Expand your search with full
text?
Okay.
As
opposed to this one, find help with AI search. That's separate?
Yes, that's different. That one is actually, you can just ask questions about, where do I find this on Family Search? This is the one right there.
All right, so I would try it, and then you're using this search box right here. You're putting in the name of your ancestor as a keyword.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other thing about it is that they are not supporting it yet, because it is it's experimental. And
we see that warning up here.
It's just saying we can't help you with this. If you have a problem, don't bother us now.
Right.
But the promise from Family Search at Roots Tech was their goal is to run everything they have digitized that hasn't been indexed, which is hundreds of millions of pages of stuff from all around the world. They're already including things from New Zealand and Mexico in there. They're going to have it all done within the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
Wow, what is that going to mean when we get overseas with some of our ancestral stuff and the documents there and finding the names? I mean, it's going to be, like we said earlier, it's going to be like DNA was 10 years ago as it just hit that tsunami.
That's right.
It's going to be the same thing with new information.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been super helpful. People are really excited about trying this out. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Go get it. Good luck.
Thank you for sharing for the last 11 years on Extreme Genes, where so many of us have gotten to know you and have been able to share in your love of family history. So we appreciate that very much.
Well, thank you, Diane. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Please join us next month in June. We will have Megan Smolyanek with us for our Ask the Expert series. So remember, if you want to make sure you get alerts, you do need to sign up for our Ask the Experts emails so that we can remind you when it's time to join us. We also send a little follow-up email with information that you might find helpful as well. So please join us next month. And thanks again, Scott. See you later.